Well, hello. My name is Derek Maxfield. I am here to talk about my latest book, published by Savas Beatty, called Man of Fire. This is part of the Emerging Civil War series, who I've written for a number of years now. It's a short biography of William Tecumseh Sherman, and I hope you'll have the opportunity to purchase it and read it for yourself. There's a lot more in it than what I can cover in 45 minutes or so. So I hope you will look to that. Let me first start my talk by talking about why Sherman. I get the question all the time, and it's worth starting there. Sherman is widely known if you are a civil warrior of sorts. He is the number two hero of the Republic, I would argue, at the end of the Civil War. And he's a controversial figure, especially in popular memory, thanks to things like Gone with the Wind. But I have found that Sherman is not that cartoonish. He is a very complex man and extremely intellectual, very passionate. And he's a guy kind of like a train wreck. You just can't look away. And I have found myself fascinated with the guy for 20 years now, and finally had the opportunity to write a biography. So I hope that you'll get a copy of this. Let me say that I'm not going to try in 45 minutes or an hour to talk about, his primary battles and things like that. I'm sure you're all aware of that. But I want to focus on things that you might not be aware of. For example, my take on Sherman is here is a man that was more insecure than you would think. A man that I would argue spent his entire life trying to figure out who he was, in fact. It was a lifelong search for identity. And I know that people find this surprising because you would think after the Civil War is over, he has secured his place in history, helping to secure the Union and have victory for the Union. But that just wasn't the case. Into the post-war years, he's general in chief, and even in retirement, he still has identity issues, and he carries this to his dying day, and I find that a little bit sad. All right, so let's start kind of at the beginning and work our way through the war. Sherman actually starts his life with an identity crisis. He's just 9 years old when he loses his father, Charles Sherman. Now, the Shermans were originally out of Connecticut, and Charles Sherman made his way to Ohio, and as a young lawyer, rose through the ranks until he had found a place on the Ohio Supreme Court. And he had done well for himself, and he brought his family to live near Lancashire and was doing very well. He went out like judges at the time and lawyers did on the circuit. He rode circuit. And so he would say goodbye to his family and he would be gone for months at a time riding the circuit. And so when he went off to circuit one day and said goodbye to his family, the children really thought nothing of it. And off he went. Little did young William Tecumseh Sherman know that that would be the last time he would see his father. It was really quite sad. Charles Sherman was away on circuit. He contracted typhoid fever, they believe, and never made it home. His wife did try to get to his bedside, but he was over 100 miles away, and she didn't make it either. Now, back in those days, bodies were buried pretty quickly. So it's very likely that young Sherman never had that opportunity either. People were afraid of disease and decomposition, and so bodies were not embalmed yet, put into caskets and put in the ground quite rapidly. So just Charles Sherman went out on circuit and essentially never came home again. And for a 9-year-old boy, I have to think that that would be a hard thing. Now, in those days, and Ohio was the frontier back in those days, there was this informal system of adoption. And on the frontier, if you had a young widow with many children, it was kind of a tradition where um, some of the children would be placed in other families, usually relatives, but sometimes neighbors, who would just bring those children into their homes. And this is what happened with William Tecumseh Sherman. Young Cump, as they called him, um, would go to live with the family of Charles Sherman's best friend. This was Thomas Ewing. And in fact, the Ewings only lived two houses up the hill from where the Shermans were. So after the funeral, Thomas Ewing came down to see uh, Mary Sherman and, said, "Of course, I'd be happy to take one of your children into my home, but I must have the brightest." And it was Sherman's sister that stepped forward and said, "Oh, you want Cumpy. You want Cumpy." And so this is how the redheaded 9-year-old went to live in the home of Thomas Ewing. So he packed what little he had and went up the hill to the big house. Now, Thomas Ewing has done well for himself too by this time. He's a leading lawyer, growing rich, and he and his family were close to the Shermans, of course. And so this was not a hard transition for young Sherman. He was already playmates with all of the Ewing children, including 5-year-old Ellen, who he will marry someday. So it was a transition that was not that difficult, and he could go down the hill and see his mother anytime. So this worked out pretty well. But though there is one kind of sticking point in all of this that will complicate Sherman's life for the rest of his life, in fact, and that was that Mrs. Ewing, Maria, had one condition. She said, "Of course, I'm happy to take, young William into our home, but if he's living with us, he must be baptized and raised Catholic." Now, young William probably had no thoughts about this at 9 years old. And they did ask Mary Sherman, Cump's mother, about this, but she was in no position to be making demands, even though she and Charles were both, devoutly Protestant. And so, young Sherman will be baptized Catholic, and there'll be pressure on him for the rest of his life to be a participating Catholic. But as time goes on, this becomes a thorn in his side, as we'll see. Now, Sherman is now living with a man on the rise. Thomas Ewing is a rising politician. He will be a United States senator. He will be a secretary of the Treasury. He will be hobnobbing with the big names, cabinet members, presidents, generals. And many of these people will come trouncing through the house in Lancashire, Ohio there. And so young Sherman, as he is growing up, it becomes normal for him to be meeting and talking with the biggest names in American politics. And so this is something that he starts to grow used to. And when he becomes of age, it is time for him to go off to West Point. Now, this is something that Charles Sherman had wanted. Thomas Ewing is in a position to make it happen now. And as it turns out, interestingly, none of the Ewing boys wanted to go. And so Sherman will get the appointment and he will go off to West Point. Now, this was something that, he didn't think much of. It wasn't really his choice. But on the other hand, he wanted to please his adoptive father. And so, he goes along with it to make Thomas Ewing happy. Now, this relationship is one that is going to grow very complicated and complex over time. Before he goes to West Point, he's just an adoptive father that Sherman wants to make happy. He wants to please him. He appreciates the Ewings for taking him in. And so, that's where they are at that point. So it's 1836 and Sherman goes off to West Point. He doesn't really know what to expect, but at least he's well prepared, they find. And Sherman will do very well at West Point. And in fact, he'll finish 6th in his class at the end of the experience. he probably would have finished third, except for demerits. West Point has the system of demerits. For example, if you can't keep your uniform clean, which was Sherman's big problem, he just could not stay tidy, and he would lose points for this, and subsequently graduates lower than he might have. Though this phased Sherman, in fact, very little. Going into it, he was ambivalent, but finds he actually likes this. He likes soldiering, he likes the camaraderie, and does, quite well for himself. He finds that drawing was one of his passions, and that's one of the classes he does quite well in. Now, from West Point, he makes a number of friends that will be useful to him over his lifetime, though I find it interesting that many of them go on to be Confederate generals, not Union generals. For example, he gets very close to P.G.T. Beauregard, the man, of course, who will be at Fort Sumter and go on to have a interesting career among the Confederacy. He's also close to people like Bragg, William Irwin, James Longstreet. He does meet U.S. Grant, but he meets Grant when he is a senior and Grant is just a plebe, and so they don't really get to know each other well there. But in short, Sherman did quite well for himself, though not well enough to make it into the Corps of Engineers. You had to be in the top 3 usually to make it into the Corps of Engineers, kind of the prestigious assignment in the Army. So Sherman is placed in the artillery when he graduates. His first posting will be to Florida, and we know that he had a grand old time in Florida. There are many people that go off on these assignments, and it's quite boring, But he arrives in Florida during just the end of the Second Seminole War. So it's just kind of cleanup duties. He spends a lot of his time, in fact, fishing and lying in the sun and quite enjoying the assignment, before going off to Charleston, South Carolina, Fort Moultrie. Now, this is a longer assignment, and he learns to love Charleston, South Carolina. Well, it will be the cradle of secession, of course. He learns to love Charleston society. He learns more about the Southern people, who he says later he loves. He quite has fun at the Victorian cotillions. He becomes very close to Robert Anderson, another man prominent at Fort Sumter later. Sherman and Anderson find that they have a common passion for art, and he is a frequent visitor to Anderson's home and Anderson's family. And later, this friendship will lead to him being posted to Kentucky, but we'll talk about that later. Interestingly, while he is posted in South Carolina, he is sent off on a remote assignment to Georgia, where he's working on old Seminole War claims. But this gives him the opportunity to ride over the ground of North Georgia all the way down to Atlanta and take in the topography of the land. He tells us later that he had a perfect memory, a photographic memory. And so later, when he's on the Atlanta campaign, he knows the land better than Joe Johnston does. And while this sounds like a boast, if you read the Atlanta campaign, you can believe it. At least I'm convinced by it. So that's an important part of this assignment. Now, I should say, meanwhile, he has an active correspondence with Ellen Ewing. Ellen, by this time, is a teenager. They have been pen pals ever since Sherman's assignment to West Point and then to Florida, only it's starting to become more romantic in nature. Now, the Ewings are starting to grow aware of this, and while it is a little bit awkward, of course, Sherman and Ellen are not biologically related. They did live in the same family home for some time, but it is growing clear to everybody that romance is in the air and perhaps marriage someday. And in fact, some of the letters between Sherman and Ellen are a little racy. So this is happening at the same time. Now, the Mexican War breaks out And all of the men that were West Point men want to rush off to war. They want to go off with Zach Taylor or Winfield Scott. And of course, they have this notion of winning military glory. Young Sherman's got the same notions as well. They all think military glory is something that places them in history at a historic moment, and they all want this. And many of Sherman's comrades, in fact, will be shipped off to war. But young Sherman instead is posted to recruiting duty in Pittsburgh, of all places, not all that far from Lancashire, Ohio. But he is mad as hell about this. He wants to be where the action is, and here he is behind a desk on recruiting duty. Now, this seems a little bit odd. He was in the artillery. He could be useful. And you don't, I think, have to read too much between the lines to perhaps see the hand of Thomas Ewing in all of this. Thomas Ewing, of course, knows about the budding romance between his daughter and Sherman, and she might have, in fact, told him that she really didn't want Sherman where the bullets would be flying. And so this might help to explain the posting to Pittsburgh. But one of the things that we know about Sherman is he never takes anything lying down, and he probably made a hell of a noise about this. And in fact, we know the War Department does eventually say, all right, well, we'll send you to California. Well, he's happy with that because that gets him closer to the action. There might be some combat in California. And so he goes along with this. He and Henry Halleck have a good old time on the boat anyway. He and Henry Halleck grew close over this time. But during this time, the boat trip was long, better than 6 months, because you had to sail down around the tip of South America and then back up the other side. And by the time that Sherman and Halleck arrive off the coast of California, all the action is over, the combat of the war is over. All you really have here are cleanup duties. And so here again, Sherman is disappointed. Though he does, I should note, have some interesting experiences in California. In 49, he is there when the gold rush starts. And so he will be with the Army out of Monterey, kind of keeping an eye on the crazies looking for gold up north around Sacramento. Though he keeps his head about him, I find it interesting. Instead of going and panning for gold himself, he opens up a little general store to service the needs of, the gold fever men, and actually makes himself a really tidy profit on this. So for me, that kind of shows here's a guy that can keep his head when other people are losing their minds. Though it does grow to be kind of boring, and he is eventually sent back east again from California and looking for a new posting, which will be eventually to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. He's promoted to captain, and he gets married. It's 1850 when Sherman finally marries Ellen. But one of the things that happens is domestic bliss isn't quite the way I would describe the relationship between Ellen and Sherman. It's a bumpy ride. The whole marriage is a bumpy ride, in fact. One of the things that happens about this time is Ellen and the Ewings put pressure on Sherman to get out of the Army. They really don't want him in the Army, and it's really a full court press to try to get him out. But Sherman's his own man. He wants to determine his own future. He does not want a job coming to him that comes through the Ewings. He wants to earn it on his own. He's very vehement about this too, and lets them know this in no uncertain terms. He's posted to St. Louis for a time. He's posted to New Orleans for a time while he's trying to find his way. He resists resigning from the Army until he can find a new path. And of course, finding his identity is part of what is happening here. Though finally, a posting or an opportunity rather comes along It's 1852, and several friends of his offer him the presidency of a bank branch in San Francisco, California. So he would have to go back to the West Coast again, though he's quite willing to do this for the right opportunity. The money's going to be good, it's stability, and in fact, what he does is he says, I like the sound of this, but I'm not going to resign from the Army just yet. I will take a 6-month leave of absence, see if this is to my liking, and only then will I resign my commission. So he kept his head about him. He didn't rush at the opportunity. He goes to San Francisco to open this bank branch and to be the president. And it works out quite well, as it turns out. So he does resign from the Army for this opportunity. Now, this means that the Shermans will be moving to California, and Ellen, and by this time they have several children, will be coming out to San Francisco. Sherman builds a nice house to receive them. But again, this does not result in wedded bliss. In fact, when Ellen arrives in California, she comes without their youngest daughter, Minnie. And so Sherman says, well, where is she? And Ellen has to tell him that she had to leave Minnie behind with her parents. And as it turns out, what happened here is the parents used kind of emotional blackmail to keep their youngest granddaughter with them. They argued that the whole family's going away, they wouldn't be able to see them, and they put pressure on Ellen to keep the little girl. Though Sherman, her father, was never asked about this arrangement, so the family arrives without her, and you can bet that he was an unhappy man. He was unhappy at Ellen for agreeing to this, but he was also really unhappy at the Ewings for doing this to Ellen. Further, Ellen doesn't like it in California, and she begins a drumbeat almost immediately to return to Ohio. One of the things about this relationship is that Ellen has some daddy issues. She has some separation anxiety about being away from her father in particular. And this is a lifelong theme that Sherman has to deal with. Many times it seems to him that Ellen is choosing between him and her father, and he often is on the losing side of this. Eventually, she makes so much noise that he sends her home, though he stipulates that the children are staying with him. No need to expose them to travel unnecessarily. And so Ellen goes on her way by herself back to Ohio, and that simplifies his life for a time. Though things at the bank don't go entirely the way that he would like, in 1857, the bank branch closes. Not that Sherman had done anything wrong. In fact, he had done quite well when you consider the economy of California at the time. But they do decide to close the bank branch, and this throws Sherman out of work. He goes back east, jobless, and really kind of rudderless for a time. He was so desperate to have something to do that he does something uncharacteristic. He goes to work in the law offices of the Ewing brothers in Kansas. So he moves down to Kansas to join this law firm. He studies the law and is admitted to the bar in just a few months' time. That's how intelligent the man was. But he doesn't really ever practice the law. He qualifies, but this is not something he wanted to do. He was just doing it, biding his time until something else came along, Ellen and the children, by the way, are in Ohio the whole time. So am I a lawyer? Is this what I want? The identity thing flares up all over again. Until finally, in 1859, opportunity beckons again. And this comes in the guise of an opportunity at a new Louisiana military academy. Sherman is very excited at this. It was Don Carlos Buell, I believe, that pointed out the opportunity to Sherman. They want a West Point graduate, of course. It's a military academy. Sherman thinks this is semi-military, right? And so it's something that has nothing to do with the Ewings. It came not at their hands, but because people admire him. And so he jumps at the opportunity. And some men who will be Confederate generals were some of his references. Richard Taylor was a reference. PGT Beauregard was a reference. And he's hired. He gets the job. So down to Alexandria, Louisiana, he goes in 1859 to be the superintendent of the new Louisiana Academy of Learning and Seminary. And this all opens in January 1860. So the clouds of war are already gathering for everybody to see. And Sherman is taking a job in the Deep South, superintendent of a military academy. And it had to occur to him, because he was an intelligent man, that if this thing turns to war, that he could be training young men that might end up in the opposing army. Now, Sherman was really kind of in denial about this, I think. He still thought in 1860 that war could be avoided, that saner minds would prevail in this, even though he saw the firebrands all around him. So 1860 was a nervous year for Sherman. It was an election year, of course, and states like South Carolina said if Lincoln wins the election, he's in a tough spot. And in fact, he made no bones about the fact, look, if there is a war, I'm going back north. And I do admire the fact that he never pulled any punches on this to the governor of Louisiana or the board of directors or anyone. Everyone was told straight, if this turns to war, I go north. I will have to resign. I am a Union man. He said it over and over. Interestingly, they put little pressure on him during the election, and he nervously rode this out. Oh, one other reason why he would have to resign. As it turns out, one of his job responsibilities was more or less to hold the keys to the federal arsenal. So he was also in charge of the federal arsenal nearby. And of course, he didn't want to be in a position after Louisiana seceded, if that's what it came to be handing over the keys of the federal arsenal. And he did not want that tarnish on his record. And so they were all told, if Louisiana should secede, he has to resign and leave. So Abraham Lincoln is ultimately elected, of course. South Carolina secedes almost immediately. They said that is what was going to happen. And so Sherman knows the writing is on the wall. And of course, Louisiana will be one of the states to go. When that happened, Sherman turned in the keys to the arsenal, and he said goodbye to his cadets in a very tear-jerking scene, apparently. And he went back north. He was very sad to lose this opportunity, but of course, he was thoroughly a Union man, as he had said. Now, by this time, Sherman's brother John is a prominent politician too. John Sherman is the newly appointed senator from Ohio. He is a Republican. He is close to Abraham Lincoln. And so when Colonel Sherman lets his brother know that he just resigned from his post at the Louisiana Academy, he is called to Washington by his senator brother. And off to Washington he goes. Now, the situation in Washington when Sherman arrives is pure chaos. Absolute chaos. And Sherman is really quite pissed off by what he sees. He even hears about open treason in the various departments within the federal government, out in the open even. Sherman is ushered into the White House through a throng of office seekers, straight into the office of the President of the United States, no appointment required. Senator Sherman brings him in, actually interrupts what Lincoln was doing to say, here's my brother, Colonel Sherman, just up from the South. He may have some information you would like. Well, this turned into a bad scene, unfortunately. And Lincoln puts out his big hand and says, well, how are things? And Colonel Sherman says, things are going swimmingly. They are preparing for war, meaning down south. And he watches the president's reaction closely. And Lincoln disappoints him and says, oh, well, I guess we'll manage to keep house somehow. or something like that. Well, Sherman, disgusted, turns on his heel and bolts out of the office, almost at a run out of the White House. His brother, the senator, trailing behind him. What's wrong? What's wrong? What happened? What's wrong? You know, and he bolts out of the building, and he finally stops and spins around to point his finger in his brother John's face to say, well, you guys have got things in a hell of a fix. More or less to tell them that they don't really understand what's happening and that this is serious. War is coming, he tells them. But even though his brother has secured for him a general's star, Sherman leaves Washington pretty much on the next train, goes out to Lancashire, Ohio. He doesn't really know what he's going to do, but he knows that the situation in Washington is bad. Now, he reaches Lancashire only to be met with all of these offers. The wires are hot with messages for him, and he turns them all down. And an interesting thing happens at this moment. All of a sudden, the Ewings want him back in the army, which Sherman finds a little ridiculous. You know, just minutes ago, being in the army is the last thing you wanted of me, and now all you want is for me to be back in the army? Well, they're all astounded that he turned down a general star. They can't understand what's happening. And Sherman, to escape the situation, actually goes to St. Louis, where his friends offer him the job as the president of a streetcar company, of all things. But he has to get away from his family. He thinks that he will outpace the offers from Washington. They are quick to catch up with him, of course. And the wires are still hot with offers and messages to bring him back to Washington. It turns out that Sherman was biding his time. He wanted to wait until the situation was better developed. He did not want to jump. He didn't want to jump at the first offer that comes to him, and he wanted the right position. He didn't want to be a general outright, he tells us, because he wants to feel like he's earned it, and he waits. And finally, the right offer comes along. He's offered command of the 13th U.S. Infantry. So this is regulars he's offered to command. And he thinks that this is better than volunteers. And so this is what he accepts finally. This is after Fort Sumter has been fired upon. And he goes back to Washington to assume command, only to find that the regiment doesn't really exist. It exists on paper, but in the meantime, he ends up working in the War Department as more or less a clerk and inspector until this really develops. He's very unhappy about this, I can tell you. Now let's fast forward a little bit for the sake of time. Sherman was at Bull Run, the first big battle, or the first battle really, of the Civil War. And Sherman is commanding an army that was unready, totally unready to go into combat, though the president was really pushing for this. And so they are forced into a confrontation with the Confederates at Bull Run, or First Manassas, if you prefer. And the situation, I'm sure you're all aware, was an utter Union disaster. It didn't start out that way. In fact, things started to look pretty good for the Union side in all of this. But it turns into ultimately a Union rout. The Union Army falls apart, more or less disintegrating, and arriving back in Washington piecemeal. Now, Sherman did well enough. His men stayed organized, under discipline. He brings them back under organization and discipline, and so they arrive an intact unit, one of the few that actually did. But it gets noticed that, his men came back in order and under discipline, while others did not. This will be one of the things that lead to him getting a promotion to brigadier general, which he was grumbling about, of course. But he and all of the Union are reassessing now. They are reassessing. Of course, they're not going to give in, though the Confederacy did think that this could lead to the surrender and the end of the war. Instead, Sherman is lured out to Kentucky. What happens is that Robert Anderson is put in command of the Department of the Cumberland and calls Sherman to be his number two. Now, by this time, Sherman is sick of Washington, D.C. He hates politicians, and he jumps at the opportunity to go work with his old friend, though he is a little anxious that he doesn't want to end up being in charge of the Department of Cumberland. He makes that very, very clear. When he arrives, they're not actually in Kentucky yet. Anderson and Sherman are in Ohio watching the situation in Kentucky. Because, of course, at this time, Kentucky was a border state. It was one of the Union slave states. And Kentucky was watching and waiting, trying to decide what to do. And what ends up happening is the Confederacy jumps the gun, forcing the hand of Kentucky, and Kentucky will largely stay in the Union, though Kentucky will furnish plenty of hands for the Confederate armies. So Anderson and Sherman then go into Kentucky, but the situation there is very chaotic. They're under a lot of stress because they're facing across the 300-mile frontier the number one general of the Confederacy. This is Albert Sidney Johnston. He's considered the number one general in the South, and so he is their possible opponent. And they are anxious because they don't have enough men. They don't have nearly enough guns or ammunition or any other accoutrements. And all of their pleas to Washington are met pretty much with stone silence. They feel kind of abandoned. And on the other side, the Confederacy, Albert Sidney Johnston, are making a lot of noise. As it turns out, Johnston is a master of propaganda. He convinces Sherman and Anderson that he's about to launch an overwhelming invasion for the Ohio River. He's going to overwhelm them with force. He's got an army of 100,000. And in fact, both Anderson and Sherman are stampeded by this. They both believe almost every word. They are frantic because the War Department is not listening. And Anderson resigns. Anderson's health really wasn't all that great anyway. He is close to retirement. And so finally, he says, enough. And so he goes into retirement, leaving Sherman holding the bag. And this is what leads us to the famous insanity episode out in Kentucky. Anybody that's familiar with Sherman will know that it was during his Kentucky time that the charges of insanity come out. And historians and biographers have been trying to figure out exactly what happened here for years. So let me summarize. Sherman's in charge of the Department of Cumberland now. He does not have the means to meet an invasion. He is frantic because the War Department is not listening. Here's a man under intense stress. He smokes 20 to 25 cigars a day. And listen, here's a man that's intense normally when he's not stressed. You know, people used to talk about spending 5 minutes with Sherman and then being so exhausted from that short conversation, they felt like they needed to go to bed for the rest of the day. He had a very piercing stare as well. So here's a guy apt to make you nervous, even when he's not. But when you add the stress, and we know insomnia, probably 25 cigars a day will do that. Here's a guy that seems a bit unhinged. And what happens is Sherman finds out the Secretary of War, at this time Simon Cameron, is coming through town on his way to St. Louis to check out the situation with Fremont there. Fremont's going to get sacked ultimately for corruption. But Sherman demands an audience with Simon Cameron on his way through, and he gets it. Though Cameron makes it very clear that he has maybe half an hour, and Cameron's got to be on his way. So they arrange for a meeting in a hotel, and Sherman meets them, and Cameron has a group of other men with him. And Sherman points to them and says, I thought we were meeting alone. And Cameron more or less said, oh, these are my friends. You can trust them, you know. So they all go into a hotel room. Sherman turns and locks the door. And here's the thing. Sherman knows I've got to convince Simon Cameron that the situation is serious. I have to convince Cameron to give me the resources I need. I only have half an hour to make this clear. So Sherman is really got to have his A game on here, and he's got to make a strong case in a short amount of time. And, he more or less overdoes it. He comes off really quite unhinged. And this is what makes these men think that, he's off his hinges. And they all take that away from this meeting, including Simon Cameron. What Sherman did not know is that those friends of Simon Cameron were journalists. Sherman's going to find this out, of course. He already hates journalists, and that's going to get worse. But the meeting ends up backfiring on Sherman spectacularly. And just a few weeks later, Henry Halleck tells him, "You're going to go home. You need some time, And in fact, he sends for Mrs. Sherman to come get him. And they send him back to Ohio on leave. Now, this is humiliating enough, though. Sherman is more or less glad not to be in charge of that department anymore. And he takes his leave and he goes back to Ohio. But meanwhile, the newspapers begin the drumbeat about Sherman being unhinged. And finally, he sees the headline. I think it was the Cincinnati newspaper. The headline is General William T. Sherman insane. So it was an Ohio or hometown paper, more or less, that runs the headline and story that he is insane. And that's one of the worst things you could say about somebody at the time. You have to remember that this is still the age of the insane asylum, and so he might never be able to escape this label. He's not ready to go into retirement, though I have to say, I don't know what I would have done about this. I might have hid under my bed and retired. I'm not really sure. The humiliation was so great. Though, Sherman had powerful friends, and they all came riding to the rescue. The Ewings pulled out all the stops. His brother, Senator Sherman, pulls out all the stops. They go to the rescue to try to overturn this impression. They, of course, want Lincoln to respect him. They don't want him to leave the army this way. And so they're the cavalry coming in to try to retrieve his reputation. Now, at this point, I should say that Halleck makes it appear that he is the closest friend of William Tecumseh Sherman. He's there to help. But what they don't know, and Sherman did not know at the time, is Halleck was one of the people that put the knife in his back. He doesn't learn that until near the end of the war. So while he's telling the Ewings and Senator Sherman one thing, he had been one of the people reporting that Sherman was insane to McClellan in Washington, leading to McClellan famously saying that Sherman had lost his head. So Halleck says, "Oh, I'll welcome him back. I'll keep an eye. We'll bring him back and I'll put him at Benton Barracks. Everything will be okay. I'm here to help." So he's trying, to make good with the Ewings and Senator Sherman. He makes it appear to Sherman himself that he cares and he wants to rehabilitate him. And so this was what begins to happen. But really, it's not till the Battle of Shiloh that Sherman begins to retrieve his reputation. By then, he's under the wing of Ulysses S. Grant, and Grant comes to admire him because he is competent, he knows how to help, he knows how to make things happen. And at Shiloh, they start to develop a warm rapport even. And after the Battle of Shiloh, this is April 1862, Grant learns to trust him and befriend him. He performed very, very well in the Battle of Shiloh. He'll get promoted as a result of this. In fact, it's reported that the whole first day might have been lost if it wasn't for Sherman. Now, this friendship that develops between Grant and Sherman, I'm sure many of you are aware, is one of the defining things about Sherman and Grant during the American Civil War. This has been written about as the friendship that won the Civil War. I think it was Braceland Flood that was one of the people that authored such a book. Now, the trajectory of Sherman's career through the rest of the war follows very closely Grant's. So they are together at the siege of Vicksburg and the campaign that precedes that. They grow very close over the course of the Vicksburg campaign, which of course ends victoriously on July 4th, 1863, where Pemberton is forced to surrender the city of Vicksburg. This is a greater victory even than the great Union victory at Gettysburg, because strategically this is important. It reopens the Mississippi River to Union commerce once Port Hudson has been opened. But because this is victorious, everybody's star rises. And Sherman becomes closer than ever to Grant. And as Grant gets promoted, Sherman gets promoted right behind him. There is a great crisis in Tennessee. Grant goes out there to try to solve the problem at Chattanooga. This is after the Union defeat at Chickamauga. Rosecrans retreats back into Chattanooga, but is besieged. Grant goes to the rescue. Rosecrans is sacked. George Thomas is put in command there. But Grant goes personally to save the situation, and he calls for his boy, Sherman. Grant is promoted in the process. The Army of the Tennessee goes to Sherman. And this is kind of how things are going to go. Now, this is a victory at Chattanooga. They retrieved the situation. Though, whether Grant really saved the day or it was George Thomas that saved the day, I'll leave you to argue. But the fact that the situation was retrieved, the Confederate Army under Bragg retreats down into Georgia, and the situation looks like a Union victory. Sherman has to go off on a wild goose chase to Knoxville, but the situation turns in favor of the Union, and Grant's star rises higher than ever. And of course, this ultimately leads to his promotion in March 1864. He is promoted to General-in-Chief of the Army. Sherman is promoted to head the military division of the Mississippi, Grant's old command. And now Sherman has 3 armies under him. Grant, of course, is going to go east, where he is going to decide to manage the armies in the field. He's going to go with the Army of the Potomac on the spring campaign. Grant and Sherman meet one last time in Cincinnati to kind of map out a strategy, though the way Sherman reports it is that it wasn't that much of a conversation. The way he reports it is Grant said, well, I'm going to go for Lee, you go for Joe Johnston. That was our plan. And this is what will develop. And Grant really didn't lay down any terms. He didn't set any conditions. He left really Sherman to develop the Atlanta campaign and the rest, however he would. And Sherman goes on to be an Army Group commander during the Atlanta campaign. He, of course, will dive into North Georgia, ground he says he remembers perfectly, and drive Joe Johnston back and drive Joe Johnston back. It was a campaign of maneuver, largely, until Johnston was forced to cross the river in front of Atlanta. And what ends up happening here is that Joe Johnston, of course, is sacked. He's replaced by John Bell Hood, and the Atlanta campaign turns into a success. Though it is interesting to note, there was a change in the midst of this campaign of objective. The objective had started out, Grant said, I want you to go for Joe Johnston's army. He wanted that army destroyed. Along the way, Sherman changed the objective to Atlanta itself, and Atlanta is captured in late August. Sherman, of course, reports that Atlanta is taken and fairly won, and the country rejoices in this great victory. This helps Lincoln get reelected, and so this all is fantastic for the Union, though it does leave John Bell Hood's army out there to harass them for some time. It's at this point when Sherman begins to outline his famous March to the Sea. Grant was not so convinced about this unorthodox campaign, which, after all, really didn't have a military objective. It was more a psychological objective. It was a head game that Sherman was playing. He wanted to convince the Confederacy, which didn't seem to understand the writing on the wall, that this war is over and you should hang it up. And in fact, Sherman will call it a humanitarian decision. And really, when you look at it closely, the fact that the Confederacy could not feed their armies by late 1864 demonstrates that this was really true. His march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah was aimed at trying to convince the Confederacy that this game was up. Because if they cannot put an army in his path, if they can do nothing to stop him marching through the heart of Georgia, how can they possibly win this war? And his campaign really does a lot of that psychological damage, though, of course, the Confederacy is not going to hang it up yet. He reaches Savannah in December 1864. Grant's first notion is to use the Navy to bring him up to help break the siege, but Sherman convinces him to let him march up through the Carolinas. Sherman's army is burning to get their hands on South Carolina, and Sherman will ultimately get his way. His army will march up through South Carolina, where Columbia will get virtually destroyed, march his way through North Carolina, before finally stopping near Goldsboro, North Carolina, to refit the army. He and Grant meet, and they plan out the last days of this war. And of course, you probably know, in April 1865, Grant chases Lee's army westward, where it gets surrounded by the Union Army and is forced to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The end of the war for Sherman, sadly, is really quite ugly. Sherman offers terms to Joe Johnston, who's back in command of the army in the Confederate Army in North Carolina. The terms that he offers are very generous and even political, though Sherman will argue that these are terms that he had been confident Lincoln would approve. The problem is by the time Sherman offers terms to Joe Johnston, Lincoln's been assassinated. And so the new president is Andrew Johnson, and in command, really, of the United States at this moment, really, was Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. And Stanton is so furious about the terms that Sherman offers that he even accuses Sherman of being on the take, that perhaps Jefferson Davis is bribing him with gold, even. And he plants stories in the press about Sherman. And the whole Sherman is insane thing resurrects. And so here, Sherman has won his laurels. He should be celebrating alongside Grant, right? And enjoying this moment. He cannot, because he's being stabbed in the back by the Secretary of War. And in fact, he's stabbed in the back by Henry Halleck. This time Sherman knows about it, though. Halleck even issues orders to Sherman's subordinate commanders not to obey Sherman's orders because he can't be trusted. You can imagine how Sherman reacts to this. So Sherman goes to the Grand Review in 1865 with his reputation not in tatters, but tarnished by these late allegations, which were ridiculous, of course, all because of terms that were too generous offered to Joe Johnston. Well, I wish I could tell you that the rest of Sherman's life got much better for him. He spends the rest of his life trying to figure out who he is, searching for his identity. He does that professionally, even while he is general of the American armies under Grant, when Grant is president. He has domestic troubles to no end. And in fact, his worst crisis in his post-war years came when he found out that his son, Tommy, became a Jesuit priest. This information had been kept from him by Ellen, his wife, until it was a done deal. And Sherman found out, and he was nearly suicidal over this. He actually wrote that his son was dead to him. It was the lowest period in his life, probably. And he struggles with his wife. He struggles with religion. He struggles with his identity to his dying day. And if it's not bad enough, that happens to be Valentine's Day when he's 70 years old. So I will end my story there. I hope you've enjoyed it. My book is available through Savage Speedy. Of course, it's available on Amazon as well. So thank you so much. I enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed having me, and I hope to see some of you in the near future. Thank you.